It was getting dark outside when Lamar, a young man with a rich past and confused thoughts, drove the last few miles along the narrow road leading to his grandmother's house. He was not one of those who often returned to his small homeland, and to be honest, there had long been a gap between him and his family of unspoken resentments and evasive, formal congratulations for the holidays. But something drew him here now. Maybe it was a sense of duty to his grandmother, who raised him when his mother was missing at work and his father was always on other people's horizons. Lamar knew that at least Grandma Estelle would be glad to see him. This thought warmed memories in my soul and gave me hope that everything would go smoothly. He parked in front of an old wooden house surrounded by a garden that had once been his grandmother's pride. The house stood in the same silence as before, and warm lights burned in the windows, as if inviting him back to the life he had been estranged from for so long. His heart was pounding with nerves and excitement, but he stepped forward, determined to spend a few days away from the hustle and bustle, relax and, perhaps, remember what a real family is. Lamar had barely knocked when the door opened and his grandmother appeared in front of him. She looked beautiful, as always tall, slender, with grey hair pulled back in a neat braid, and a dazzling smile that always hugged him even from a distance. Her eyes immediately filled with tears of joy. She hugged him, clinging to him as if she was afraid that he would disappear again for many years.
"Oh, Lamar, you've come after all. And how glad I am to see you. Honestly, I thought you'd forget about your old grandmother."
Grandma, come on. I couldn't help but come. You just know, there's a lot to do in the city, you know.
They entered the house, and Lamar noted that everything remained almost as before: a cozy living room with a soft carpet, a rocking chair by the window where Grandma liked to sit in the evenings, and a lot of old photos on the walls. Grandma Estelle did not seem to have changed, only her step became a little more cautious, and her face was covered with barely noticeable wrinkles, which only added to her wisdom and dignity. Lamar felt guilty for the years he hadn't spent with her, for all the conversations that never happened, and for all the time that he couldn't get back. Grandma took care of everything. Hot dishes were already steaming on the table. She had prepared Lamar's favorite chicken stew, and there was a glass of cool lemonade next to it. She always remembered his tastes, even when he hadn't remembered his own for a long time. Lamar ate with gusto, remembering how he once ate the same dish at the same table as a boy. They hardly spoke during the meal, enjoying the silence and the warm presence of each other. When Lamar had finished, his grandmother suggested that he walk to the end of the street, to where the river roared and a small park began. Lamar, although tired from the road, did not refuse. His soul was looking for peace, and a walk under the evening sky seemed the perfect way to relieve the burden of accumulated thoughts. They walked slowly down the street, and Estelle told him about life in the area, about how everything had changed. The old neighbors had moved away, and their houses were occupied by new families, young and full of energy, not at all like the old-timers with whom she had shared so many years. And only one of her friends, Ida, remained by her side, unchanged. Like Estelle herself, they were united by a long history of friendship and support for each other when others left them.
"By the way, you will meet Ida. She was going to come over for tea tomorrow night. I told you about her, but you probably don't remember anymore."
I remember, of course. You've always mentioned her as your most loyal friend.
Estella nodded happily, and they continued on their way in silence. The night had thickened around him, and Lamar was looking at the stars, which he rarely saw in the city because of the bright lights. Here, away from the noise and light, the sky seemed endless, deep and surprisingly clear. Looking at the stars, Lamar felt the tension leave him, giving way to something long-forgotten calmness and a slight longing for the carefree days of childhood. After returning home, they said goodbye until morning, and Lamar went to his old room. Soaked in the scent of lavender, this room held so many memories. Here he once lay under the same blanket, thinking about the future, dreaming of escaping into the big world, which beckoned him with new prospects. And so, after so many years and all that he had been through, this world brought him back to his origins, to his grandmother, who was still waiting for him here, as promised. Lying in bed, Lamar thought about tomorrow. Too much has accumulated in his life, and perhaps this visit is not just a tribute to his grandmother, but a chance to review his life, try to find answers to questions that have been hovering in his head for a long time. His grandmother's friend, Ida, flashed into his thoughts as something distant and unimportant. He did not attach any importance to this tomorrow. He would just say hello, show respect, and then take care of his vacation, as planned. The night absorbed Lamar's thoughts, and he gradually fell asleep, taking with him the image of the starry sky, his grandmother's warmth, and the feeling that this house would always remain a place of peace and protection for him. Tomorrow he will start his vacation here, a vacation from himself, from everything that exhausted and deprived him of strength. The next morning Lamar woke up to the sound of birds singing and morning worries coming from the kitchen. The sun's rays shyly made their way through the thick curtains, filling the room with soft light. He stretched, enjoying the silence around him, and remembered that today his grandmother was scheduled to have a small tea with her friend Ida. She had mentioned it the day before, but it didn't seem significant to him at the time. After leaving the room, Lamar found his grandmother preparing breakfast. She was as collected and full of energy as ever, although her hands sometimes trembled slightly when she sliced bread. Lamar watched her warmly, still marveling at her fortitude and strength after all. The woman was not young, but at the same time she seemed to him tireless. Grandma made him coffee and put a plate of fried eggs and toasted toast in front of him, preparing something like a routine conversation.
Do you remember, Lamar, that Ida is coming in today? She'll like you, I'm sure. She always loved to talk about how you were a little fidget. We've been friends for a long time, and you should talk to her.
Lamar nodded, not paying much attention to his grandmother's words. He believed that all this tea was just a way to kill time for the elderly, and he himself had nothing special to do there. But not wanting to upset his grandmother, he just smiled and agreed to meet this mysterious friend, whom, according to Estella, he had known since childhood. When it was time for the meeting, Grandma sat Lamar down in the living room, and she went out into the garden to meet her friend. He had heard them talking on the porch, but had not yet seen Ida herself. Taking a deep breath, Lamar set himself up for a long conversation about old times and family tales. However, what awaited him turned out to be completely unexpected. When Estelle returned to the house with Ida, Lamar noticed that his grandmother's friend looked far from what he had imagined. Her figure, slender and toned, attracted attention, and at first glance she did not even seem to be a woman of advanced age. Ida was charming. Her skin, smooth and dark, seemed to absorb the light, and her movements were full of a kind of confident grace. She stepped into the room with a slight smile, and her calm gaze immediately caught Lamar, as if she was looking at him closely. He noticed the thin bracelets on her wrists and the large earrings that swayed slightly, giving her image a slightly more exotic look.
Well, that's what he is, an adult Lamar. It's been so many years since we've seen each other. I think the last time you were very young.
These words of hers slightly stunned him. Lamar couldn't believe that it was his grandmother's friend standing in front of him, and not someone from another time, closer to his own. She held out her hand to him, a light touch that somehow made him feel a wave of warmth. Her gaze was piercing, and when their eyes met, Lamar felt as if she could see right through him, as if she could read his thoughts, hidden fears and internal contradictions. Lamar shook her hand, forgetting caution for a moment, and Grandma, noticing how they looked at each other, smiled with some subtle pride, as if she understood more than she was saying. It all started with a light conversation. Ida asked Lamar about his life, work and the city in which he lived. With each of her questions, he felt the tension disappear, and it became easier for him to talk to her. There was something strange about her presence that calmed him down and at the same time made his heart beat faster.
Are you probably used to the noise of the big city? It's quieter here, of course, but silence is also its own world.
Yes, it's different there. There are too many people, too many sounds, and frankly, sometimes you get tired of it.
Her gaze became a little more thoughtful. She nodded as if she understood more than just his words, and for a moment there was silence between them. Lamar felt his gaze drawn back to her. Her face, framed by light grey hair, seemed calm and wise, and there was a slight smile on her lips that both calmed and kindled something new inside. Ida was a woman full of contradictions. Her age was betrayed only by some small wrinkles and silver threads in her hair, but at the same time she possessed the brightness and charm that are usually characteristic of the young. Estelle, seeing how they were talking, left them alone, deciding to do the cooking in the kitchen, giving them the opportunity to get to know each other better. Lamar barely noticed her departure. Only Ida remained in the room, and the atmosphere became a little tense, as if they both understood that something important was happening, but did not know how to express it. Ida leaned slightly towards him. Her movements were soft and measured. She seemed to read his inner state, but did not try to ask anything. She was just there, listening and making it clear that he could say whatever he wanted. After a while, Ida suggested a walk in the garden, and Lamar agreed without even thinking about it. He wanted to get to know her more, to feel her next to him and understand why he suddenly felt so comfortable in her presence. They went outside. The air was fresh and filled with the aromas of herbs. Walking through the garden, Lamar felt unusually vulnerable, as if his every step, every word now had a special meaning. He couldn't figure out where this excitement came from, but every time he looked at Ida, it only intensified this feeling.
Did you ever think that you would come back here? Sometimes we need to go back to where it all started to figure out what's really important.
I didn't think about it, but now I feel that maybe this is exactly what is needed. Everything became too complicated in my life, and I wanted to feel something real again.
She looked at him for a long time, and Lamar realized that she knew more than she was saying, that her life was also full of its trials and internal battles. There was a wisdom in her eyes that fascinated him. They continued to walk through the garden, ignoring the time, as if every moment of this meeting meant more than either of them would dare admit. As they walked back to the house, their eyes suddenly met, and Lamar felt something change inside him. He couldn't explain the feeling. It was something more than just sympathy or interest. There was a woman in front of him who could become a teacher and friend for him, could teach him to look at the world in a new way, but at the same time she seemed painfully close to him, as if she had known him all his life. When they returned, Grandma was already waiting for them in the kitchen. She noticed their gazes, but said nothing, only addressed Ida with tenderness in her voice, as if maintaining this tacit understanding between them. Ida said goodbye to Lamar, but her gaze left in him that inexplicable feeling that he could not get out of his head. When she left, Lamar sat in silence for a long time, thinking about her words, and that in this small house, in this tiny village, he suddenly met something that changed his heart. After meeting Ida, Lamar noticed that every day he spent here at his grandmother's had acquired a different rhythm, filled with unexpected expectation. Being a city dweller, accustomed to living among concrete walls and neon lights, he always felt like a stranger in a world where peace and quiet were the main thing. However, now he found something fascinating about these simple, quiet days. The way to the store, a walk along the paths by the river, a simple tea in the kitchen, everything seemed special, as if pierced with a new meaning. Ida, his grandmother's friend, fell into his soul from the first meeting. Her presence became a kind of attraction for him, from which it was impossible to escape. Lamar did not know what attracted him to her so much, and did not try to find an explanation for it. Instead, he allowed himself to feel this inexplicable attraction, which grew stronger every day. At first he found an excuse for this. They say he just wants to get to know her better, to understand her story. But the more time they spent together, the clearer it became to him that there was much more between them than just a friendly interest. Ida seemed to respond in kind. Although they both tacitly avoided talking about their strange closeness, their every look said more than words could convey. Lamar was amazed at how easily she managed to stay calm, how naturally she carried herself, as if she did not notice the tension that filled the air whenever they were alone. He began to see her more often, not because of any established arrangements, but simply because she appeared at the right moments, as if she knew when he wanted to see her. They bumped into each other by accident, and this intensified his feelings, making their meetings even more tremulous and forbidden. When Lamar noticed her in the garden at his grandmother's house, he couldn't help but smile. It seemed that Ida could have stood there for hours, watching the flowers or picking through the dry leaves, but when her gaze rested on him, something inside came to life. She always looked calm, as if she didn't notice his gaze, but still sometimes gave him such a piercing look that he felt uncomfortable, not knowing how to justify his own feelings. Her soft smile, her demeanor, all this firmly captured him, and without realizing it, he waited for every new day just to see her again. They often found themselves together on morning walks or at evening gatherings at Grandma's kitchen. Ida became for him like a secret magnet that haunted him. In every movement she made, every glance she cast in his direction, he found a certain mystery that fascinated him more and more. It wasn't just sympathy, it was a desire to get to know her completely, to touch what was hidden behind her impassive expression. He couldn't understand how someone living in such silence and solitude could remain so mysterious and attractive. Lamar began to pay more attention to his appearance, although he tried to convince himself that it was an accident. He pretended not to care about his clothes, hairstyle, or voice, but deep down he knew he wanted to impress her. Every time he met with Ada, he tried to look at ease without showing his feelings. However, she seemed to feel it all unmistakably, as if she saw through him. He couldn't escape these thoughts, they had become an integral part of his time here. Ida appeared in his thoughts, not just as a woman, she embodied something more than the image of an attractive person. She became his guide to a world he would never have immersed himself in. Her outlook on life was both light and deep. Her stories are always full of warm wisdom, but not pretentious. She knew how to inspire and not try to teach. Each of her stories became a lesson for him that did not require answers. Listening to her, he gradually realized how much his world was different from the world in which Ida lived, but at the same time he found amazing similarities in their inner desire for freedom and understanding. Sometimes, watching her in the garden, Lamar noticed how easily she discarded any seriousness. She could sit deep in thought, and after a moment a smile would light up her face. With age, she gained the ability to enjoy the little things, and Lamar, on the contrary, was lost for a long time in search of something more. It was this feeling of peaceful contemplation of life that emanated from Ida that attracted him like magnets attract iron. She was the epitome of calm and vitality, which Lamar, accustomed to the hustle and bustle, felt like a breath of fresh air. Every day he became more dependent on her presence. His infatuation grew despite all the sound arguments and internal prohibitions. It was something uncontrollable, as if nature itself told him that this path was inevitable, that he should come to this, even if the consequences might be difficult. He was aware that these feelings were leading him into an inevitable conflict with himself, because he had never experienced anything like this before. Lamar also noticed that Ida behaved with a certain caution, as if she understood his feelings but did not allow herself to succumb to them. She kept a small distance between them, reminding him that all this was just a beautiful illusion, short-lived and perhaps doomed to break. But even so, he still felt his inner barrier breaking down, as his heart continued to reach out to her, filling his life with new meaning. Each of their meetings became a small celebration filled with hidden meaning. Their silence said more than words could say. They found common ground in a simple glance, a fleeting touch, or a silence that required no explanation. For Lamar, these moments became an oasis in the desert of his urban life. They filled his heart with a feeling that he had long lost, a sense of warmth and joy from simple things. Ida remained for him like an unknown island, alluring and dangerous at the same time. He knew that every touch of her world made him sink deeper into a feeling he couldn't control. He knew that her presence revealed to him something about himself that he had not known before. And even though this attraction seemed wrong and contradictory to him, he could no longer just ignore it. The relationship between Lamar and Ida took on that subtle shade that distinguishes friendship from something much deeper and more personal. Hiding their attraction, they found ways to spend time together, as if meeting by chance in their grandmother's garden or unplanned, bumping into each other at a local park. These meetings were secret, but every moment spent together turned into an invaluable memory for them. At first it was casual glances, timid touches and light touches. Lamar felt like he was on the verge between reality and something unattainable. It seemed that he was still the same urban dweller who had come to his grandmother only for a short time, but at the same time his whole being was filled with a new strength, a new feeling that could neither be explained nor controlled. He came closer each time, and although both understood that these feelings were wrong from the point of view of society, this did not stop them. Every morning he looked for her in the garden, where she was walking or tending flowers. Lamar froze when he saw her among the bright flower beds and green foliage, as if she were a part of nature itself, this earth and these flowers. He stayed at a distance, watching as her hands carefully picked through the flower stalks, with what care and tenderness she tended each plant. Her movements were so natural and beautiful that Lamar couldn't look away without feeling guilty for his obsessive attachment. Over time, they began to meet more often, although they never talked about it openly. They didn't discuss their feelings, they didn't make promises, but there was always this hidden connection in their relationship. Lamar tried to stay calm and not betray his emotions, but every touch, every look they exchanged was full of a secret meaning that both brought them closer and at the same time kept them on the edge. These were moments that required silence from them, but the silence between them became a space for something more than words. One evening, after a particularly hot day, they met on the embankment of a local park, where the air was cool and the sky was beginning to turn dark shades before nightfall. Lamar walked over to Ida, and his heart began to beat so hard, as if it was about to burst out of his chest. They stood side by side, watching the water, which was gently swaying in a light breeze. It seemed that the world around them had quieted down, leaving them alone with their own thoughts and feelings. Lamar felt that he was attracted to her by something inexplicable, that every moment with her made him forget about the outside world. They began to meet at this place often, choosing evening hours when the park was empty and became their personal hideout. Ida, always calm and confident, also seemed to change at such moments. She was getting softer, and Lamar felt that there was something deep, unsolved in her eyes. He knew that their attraction to each other was growing every day, but they both tried to hold on without breaking the invisible line that protected them from something irreversible. Gradually, their meetings became more personal, filled with tenderness and awe. Sometimes, when they were walking in the evening park, Lamar dared to hold her hand, and she allowed it, as if acknowledging that resistance was no longer possible. These moments became a consolation for them when the whole world seemed distant and alien. They silently enjoyed each other, as if they were afraid to wake up this dream, where only the two of them existed, without condemnation and restrictions. Over time, Lamar began to realize that their relationship was not just a casual affair, but something that could change his whole life. Ida became for him a kind of secret refuge, where he found peace and joy that he could not find in his usual life. He felt that he was becoming more attached to her every day, and this feeling grew, despite all his efforts to hold on. At the same time, he understood that every evening, every meeting they had brought closer the moment when they would have to face reality. The time spent with Ida gave him new feelings and knowledge about himself. Lamar felt alive and fulfilled, but he couldn't help but realize that his feelings for her were forbidden fruit. He knew that this affair, despite its strength, required secrecy, and that they both had to keep this secret. But deep down, he knew that he was hiding something important from himself, which could eventually destroy everything he was used to. Ida, always calm and confident, also began to show tenderness, which Lamar felt was something new for her. He did not know what this caution of hers was connected with, but he saw in her eyes the depth of feelings that she hid behind her outward calmness. Her gaze at him was full of warmth, and every time he caught her doing it, his heart skipped a beat. Lamar understood that she, like him, was on the verge of succumbing to these feelings or giving up on them. She, like him, was struggling with herself. These evenings in the park, where they could be alone, did not become just a habit, it was something more. Lamar and Ida began to find in each other not only understanding and comfort, but also something like a joint shelter from the world where they both had to play their roles. Here, in a quiet park under the starry sky, they could afford to be themselves, forgetting for a while about all the limitations and fears. Lamar was making sure every day that he felt real around her. The mystery of their relationship has become their special ritual. Every evening they return to this secluded place, as if to their sacred vows. Lamar knew that his attraction to Ida was not just a hobby, it was a new, unknown world, full of warmth, which he had not experienced for a long time. He did not know where this connection would lead him, but he could not stop, could not give up what filled his life with a new meaning. Ida remained to him a kind of mystical spirit capable of giving him a sense of peace and joy. She was opening up a world to him that he hadn't known before, and Lamar was ready to follow her, even if it meant that one day they would have to pay dearly for it. As time went on, Lamar and Ida's secret romance seemed to have a life of its own, separate from the rest of the world. They enjoyed every moment they spent together and found solace in doing it in secret. But as their affection grew stronger, the shadow of reality began to hang over their meetings. Both Lamar and Ida began to realize that their feelings could not be indefinitely hidden, and that sooner or later their romance would go beyond their small world, where they could be themselves. Lamar's anxious thoughts began to torment him first. He increasingly wondered how his grandmother would react and how his feelings for her friend would be perceived. Estelle was one of the closest people to him, the unshakable support that had stood behind him since childhood. He knew that his grandmother was full of love and wisdom, but still he could not doubt that she would understand him in this difficult matter. After all, Ida is more than just a friend for Estella, she is a part of her life, the life that her grandmother has long considered settled and stable. Lamar couldn't help but think about how other people would perceive his relationship with Ida. He grew up in an environment where age-dictated boundaries were perceived as a natural framework. And although his heart told him that a real connection does not know such limitations, his mind convinced him otherwise. Every time he returned to his grandmother's house after secret meetings with Ada, he felt anxious, as if two different people were fighting in him. One said that their love was something pure and true, and the other warned of the inevitable consequences. This conflict was tearing him apart, making him doubt whether he was doing the right thing. Ida also couldn't help but realize the complexity of the situation. Despite her outward confidence, she felt the growing pressure of responsibility for their feelings. She was much older than Lamar, and her experience suggested that such affairs rarely end peacefully. She understood that Lamar still had his whole life ahead of him, full of opportunities and meetings, and it hurt her to realize that their relationship could deprive him of some of these opportunities. Her heart was drawn to him, but her mind coldly reminded her that their relationship in the eyes of society would be perceived as something inappropriate, to say the least. These thoughts began to torment them both. They began to ask themselves questions that they had previously tried to avoid. Lamar wondered if he could be happy in a relationship that should remain a secret. He could feel the guilt gradually overshadowing his joy. The doubts that he had initially dismissed were now seeping into his mind, filling his days and nights with uncertainty and anxiety. He understood that their affair was not just a matter of two people. It was something that could be painful not only for them, but also for their loved ones. Ida began to withdraw into herself more and more often, closing herself off from Lamar. She could no longer enjoy their meetings as much as before, because she knew that each new meeting only worsens their affection. She couldn't stop thinking that one day this affair would turn into disappointment and suffering. She was not at the age to allow herself to lose herself in feelings, and she was well aware that their relationship was a risk for both. Her heart told her one thing, but life experience and caring for Lamar made her pull away, no matter how hard it was. Gradually, their romance began to change. If before they had found joy and peace in every look, in every touch, now their meetings were full of tension. Lamar noticed that Ida was getting colder, tried to keep her distance and avoided his gaze. He tried to understand her feelings, tried to find answers to his questions, but he couldn't ignore the fact that she was also starting to distance herself. He was afraid of losing her, but he didn't know how to regain the lightness they had experienced in the beginning. An uneasy feeling was growing in Ida's heart as well. She understood that their affection had gone too far, that both of them would no longer be able to easily break off this relationship without pain and loss. She fought with herself, trying to suppress her feelings and regain control of the situation, but every time she saw Lamar, her heart started beating faster again. She was gripped by the fear that their romance, despite all the strength of their feelings, was doomed to break up. She couldn't afford to hope for a future with him, but it was almost impossible to break that bond either. Lamar and Ida began to avoid topics related to their feelings, trying to focus on simple moments, as before. But the tension between them only grew. They knew that this relationship had become more than just a hobby for both of them. The difficulties and doubts they experienced increasingly came into their lives, poisoning every moment they could have spent happy and serene. They both understood that there was a shadow of prohibition between them that could not be ignored. And doubts became their constant companions. Lamar began to wonder what he was willing to do for this love, how far he was willing to go, and whether it would be too much of a burden for him. He loved Ida, but increasingly realized that this feeling was associated with pain and difficulties that he might not be able to withstand. Every time he tried to drown out these thoughts, they came back, getting stronger every day. Ida was tormented by the realization that her feelings for Lamar had become a burden to him. She saw how he was suffering from internal conflict and felt that she had no right to impose her feelings on him. Her heart was breaking because despite all the doubts, she knew that her affection for Lamar was not superficial. However, she was increasingly coming to the conclusion that perhaps the best way out for both of them was to break off this relationship, even if it hurt her. Doubts became an insoluble barrier for them, and every next day brought new questions. They both knew that the moment was approaching when they would have to make a choice that would determine their fate. Lamar and Ida knew that their feelings could not remain a secret forever, that sooner or later their romance would become a reality for those around them, and they would have to accept it. The past weeks have been a real emotional ordeal for Lamar. He realized that his feelings with Ada were doomed to struggle with their own fears, social views, and anxiety for the future. His soul was tormented by the realization that their secret romance, which they cherished so much, would inevitably take shape beyond the boundaries of their secluded world. Each of their dates seemed like a breath of fresh air to him, but these moments were invariably followed by a feeling of guilt and fear that one day he would have to reveal everything. In the evenings, after he left Ida and returned to his grandmother, Lamar could not find peace. His mind was filled with thoughts about how difficult it would be to admit everything to his grandmother, how her reaction would change not only his relationship with her, but also with himself. He knew that maybe her attitude towards him would never be the same if she found out the truth. However, he could no longer continue to live in the shadows. Every look he took at Ida, every breath he took next to her, became a confirmation that she was his only real connection with himself, and it became simply unbearable to hide it. Ida herself also felt the inevitability of the coming decision. With every meeting, with every moment when they could be sincere with each other, she realized that their affection had become so strong that it was no longer possible to remain in the shadows. Ida saw Lamar suffer from remorse and fear, realizing that each of their dates, although full of happiness, also becomes a cause for alarm. She began to realize that they needed to find a way to open up to someone who was so important to Lamar. Every evening when they said goodbye and returned to their solitary rooms, they could not get rid of the feeling that their love should no longer be enclosed within a mystery. The autumn evening brought cold, humid air, and Lamar, wrapped in a warm blanket, sat thoughtfully on the porch of his grandmother's house, gathering his courage. He knew that this conversation would change his life. His heart was pounding like never before, filled with both fear and hope. He looked at the landscape in front of the house, covered with a light autumn mist, and felt that this scene somehow symbolized his inner state, the fog of uncertainty covering his future and past, receding only when he could look at it all with clarity and honesty. Ida joined him, feeling that this moment would require all their courage and honesty. They were silent, standing side by side, both lost in their own thoughts, knowing that the decision could not wait any longer. Lamar and Ida decided that they would be together, that they would take the risk and open up to their grandmother, despite all their fears. Grandma was not just a family person for Lamar, she personified for him everything that warmth, support and family meant, and her acceptance or rejection of this acceptance could be fateful for him. When they entered the house, the warm light of the lamps filled the rooms, as if the house itself understood that something important was about to happen. Grandma Estelle was setting the table, as always. She greeted Lamar with the same affectionate smile, but Lamar understood that after today, this smile may never be so serene. However, he also knew that being honest with her was the only way for his and Ada's feelings to have a right to exist. Estelle noticed his serious gaze and Ida's smile, so rare lately. She felt that her grandson had come to her with something that was important for him to share. After looking at them, she invited them to the table. They sat down, and Lamar realized that this was probably the most crucial moment of his life. He knew that his every word would be carefully listened to, that her reaction would not be superficial. Grandma had always been a person who perceives everything with deep understanding and feeling. But he also knew that the topic he was going to bring up could have a big impact on their relationship. Lamar took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. His voice was calm, but everything inside him was trembling with tension. He began the story, starting with how he met Ida and how their relationship developed. He openly shared what he felt, talking about his inner conflict, about the affection that turned out to be unexpected for himself. There was sincerity in every sentence, and Estelle seemed to understand that her grandson wasn't just talking out of guilt or fear. She did not see a child in front of her, but a man who was faced with a feeling far beyond his ability to resist. Lamar revealed everything to his grandmother. He did not hide that Ida had become for him not just a woman, but someone who awakened in him the desire to be real, not to hide behind masks and not succumb to the usual norms. He talked about how sincerely he admires Ida, how her calmness and wisdom have become a support for him, and how he can no longer continue to hide it, because for him she is more than just a family friend. There was sincere pain and awe in his words. He did not hide his love or his fears in front of his grandmother, allowing her to see him as he really is. Estella was silent, listening to him to the end. In her gaze, Lamar saw how she weighed everything he said, how her face was covered with deep lines of thought. She knew that this conversation was not just an emotional moment, but a key turn in her grandson's life, perhaps a turn that would determine what kind of person he would become. She also understood that her own reaction would be a decision for Lamar that would either support him or become a source of enduring pain. Several weary minutes passed, during which Lamar experienced all shades of despair and hope. He knew that her answer would be the last frontier for him, beyond which either the long-awaited acceptance would come, or he would have to face loneliness and rejection. Estelle continued to stare at him in silence, and each of her looks seemed to reveal to him her heart filled with wisdom, love, and life experience. When Grandma finally made her choice, there was no condemnation or detachment in her eyes. There was only a soft, understanding light in it, which Lamar will always remember. She nodded softly at him, accepting his feelings, his choices, his life as it had become. Lamar felt a relief that could not be expressed in words. At that moment he realized that he had gained not only the support of his grandmother, but also the permission to be himself without fear and guilt. It was the answer that freed his soul and heart. Ida felt it too. She saw in this nod of her grandmother's acceptance and her own release from the fear that their relationship would burden Lamar. They both found in this acceptance the peace they had been missing for so long, and the realization that their love had a right to exist. Since Lamar arrived at his grandmother's, every day seemed to be enveloped in something new, which he could not immediately realize but felt with his whole being. At first he blamed it on his fatigue from the city, on the need to finally break out of the frenzied rhythm and just relax, but every morning he caught himself thinking that he was looking forward to meeting Ida. These meetings were not planned like the first time. He accidentally noticed her near the house, on the way to the store, or by the river. In her presence, the world around her seemed to lose its contours. It went into shadow, leaving only her calm figure, smooth movements, and mysterious smile. He couldn't explain why he felt so close to her, but he wasn't trying anymore. Morning came unexpectedly and, it seemed, early. The sun barely touched the trees. Its golden light glided over the grass covered with dew and penetrated through the windows into the grandmother's house. Lamar usually woke up at this hour. A little later, when the sun was rising higher, he could hear Estelle fussing in the kitchen. He tried not to disturb her, not to talk unnecessarily, but her care, the simplicity with which she cooked his favorite dishes, warmed him. However, Ida often appeared in my thoughts, her figure gliding smoothly between the trees and bushes near the neighboring plot. Every meeting with her happened by chance and seemed unexpected, but Lamar began to catch himself looking for her. At first timidly, without realizing it, he slowed down his pace, as if casually looking into her yard. Then, walking along the riverbank, he always slowed down a little, so that suddenly he would meet her there, on a winding path. She moved with such confidence and ease, as if she always knew he was there. At the moments when Lamar suddenly noticed her, everything seemed to slow down, the light acquired a special softness, and his heart began to beat a little faster. Something inexplicable, almost magical, happened to him when she was around. One day Lamar went for a walk to the river, trying not to think about whether he would meet Ida there or not. He tried to convince himself that it was just a morning desire to get some fresh air, to feel the simplicity and naturalness of life. But as soon as his gaze caught sight of her among the trees a little to the side, barely visible, with her dark eyes watching him from the shadows, he felt a wave of warmth sweep over him. Watching her move easily among the trees, Lamar suddenly realized that every day this woman was becoming something much more to him than just a friend of his grandmother. These morning walks became something of a ritual for him. Sometimes he would spend an hour, maybe two, by the river, just staring into its water, trying to figure out what exactly he liked so much here, away from the hustle and bustle. But every time he met Ida by chance, he felt his inner world changing. He did not tell her about it, tried to restrain his feelings, but in her presence something inexplicable and powerful made his heart contract. He did not try to find an explanation for this attraction, did not try to set boundaries for himself. He just enjoyed her presence, her silent steps, her calmness that seemed to extend to everything around him. More and more often he caught her gaze, barely noticeable, but full of tenderness and hidden wisdom. And at that moment, it seemed that an invisible connection was being established between them, strong and indissoluble. Lamar knew that he should not give in to this feeling, that such affection was unacceptable. But every time he looked into her eyes, these thoughts disappeared, leaving only a simple, quiet desire to be near. These moments lasted only a few seconds, but they had so much meaning and depth that Lamar felt an inexplicable sense of peace envelop him. Ida remained the same, confident and calm. Her gaze never betrayed any emotions, but he felt that she also noticed his feelings, saw how he was looking for her gaze, how he held his breath when she was near. Her presence became a kind of drug for him, which he could not get enough of. She was his shadow, the one who is always present, but never interferes, never says too much. Lamar didn't know how long he could hold back his feelings, but every day he spent with her strengthened his affection. One day, late in the evening, Lamar went out for a walk in the garden. The stars were slowly lighting up in the sky, and the silence around him filled his heart with peace. He walked along the winding path leading to the river, lost in his thoughts. At that moment he heard a slight rustle of grass and, turning, saw Ida walking towards him. She was dressed in a simple light-colored dress. Her hair fell freely over her shoulders, and the starlight was reflected in her eyes. Ida did not immediately notice him, but when her gaze fell on Lamar, something flashed in her eyes that he could not decipher. They stood silently watching each other. Lamar didn't know what to say, how to explain why he was attracted to her. At that moment he felt like he was trapped between reality and a dream. Ida was so close that he wanted to touch her hand, feel the warmth of her skin. But he restrained himself, afraid to break this thin, barely perceptible line that connected them.
It seems that we met by chance again.
Ida smiled slightly. Her face remained calm, but there was a warm spark in her eyes.
It's always quiet here in the evenings. I love this place.
Her voice was soft as velvet, and Lamar felt that voice envelop him like a cool wind touching his face. She didn't say anything special, but her words left him with a feeling of something big, inexpressible in words. They stood side by side, immersed in silence, each of them aware that something much deeper was going on between them than a simple acquaintance. Lamar knew he couldn't stay away for long, that this feeling was consuming him. He sought solace in the silence around him, but every time he looked at her, his inner conflict only intensified. He wanted to be there, to listen to her voice, to look into her eyes, but at the same time he understood that these feelings doomed him to pain and uncertainty. There was no fear in her eyes. She looked at him as if she understood his feelings, as if she knew that he was going through this, but she remained calm, as if she knew how to find balance in any situation. Every day Lamar realized that these meetings were becoming more important to him. He didn't need words, he didn't need to explain how he felt, but her presence gave him confidence that he wasn't alone. She understood him, without words, without promises, but her look said more than any phrases could say. Lamar felt that this connection was becoming a salvation for him, a light that led him through the darkness. Her silence, her light smile and calm gaze filled his soul with peace, and he began to realize that this feeling was becoming something special for him. After spending a few more minutes with her, Lamar decided to leave, realizing that if he stayed even a little longer, he would not be able to contain his feelings. He said goodbye to Ida, and her gaze stayed with him, like an invisible fire that burned in his soul. her eyes, the calmness, her inner world, became something more than just an image for him. She was the one he longed for, the one who gave him strength. But Lamar knew that this fire could be fatal for him, that his love for her carries both joy and inevitable pain. There was a strange feeling in his soul that Ida was also experiencing something similar, but she was acting as if it was just a game that did not affect her. He wanted to tell her about it, to confess his feelings, but he knew that words would only destroy this fragile silence that united them. Lamar silently continued to watch her, her quiet confidence and calm wisdom, and a feeling that he could neither name nor suppress flared up in his heart. Every morning, when he woke up, he looked for her gaze, her presence, her silent approval. She was something to him that reminded him of the serenity and wisdom of life. The next evening Lamar went for a walk again. He was drawn to the park, and he went there for a specific purpose, although he did not admit it to himself. The evening was quiet, the air was cooling from the heat of the day, and the last rays of the sun were disappearing, leaving crimson and dark streaks in the sky that would soon be covered with stars. It was the silence and peace that pulled him, and he knew that Ida might be somewhere nearby. Deep in the park, in the shade of old trees, his gaze suddenly fell on her figure. She stood by a small clearing, looking at the setting sun, and seemed far away and inaccessible. Something in her posture suggested that she was lost in thought, and Lamar paused for a moment, trying to decide whether to come closer. He felt a strange, acute excitement in her presence, but he realized that it was not just curiosity or mild interest. It was an attraction, as if something inside was forcing him to go to her, to be near her. He stood for a while, just watching her move slowly, changing her position, raising her hand to her face, as if hiding her thoughts. Steeling himself, he took a step, then another. His legs slowly led him to Ida, although an internal struggle was raging inside him. He understood that this feeling could not be explained in words, that in her presence he lost control of himself, as if he were entering another dimension where there was no time or boundaries. As Lamar approached, Ida turned to him, her eyes reflecting his own confusion, but her voice remained calm.
Are you here again?
He nodded, not knowing what to say. Her voice was as soft as the whisper of the wind, and there was something in it that made his heart beat faster. She stood in front of him, in her casual, simple outfit, and seemed as casual as ever, but he knew that there was more to it than that. Her eyes, a look full of inner light, all this awakened feelings in him that he had been trying to suppress for a long time. He tried to find the right words, to explain how he felt, but all he could do was just stand there, looking into her eyes. Every word seemed to him insufficient, incomplete. Lamar did not understand that he was attracted to her, but her presence became something for him that filled the inner void that he had carried for many years. And now that Ida was there, he knew he couldn't just leave without telling her the truth. She was much more to him than just his grandmother's friend, and this feeling consumed him completely.
I do not know why, but I want to see you every day.
The words came out of his mouth. He didn't have time to restrain himself. Ida did not look away. Her gaze remained unchanged, but in the depths of her eyes Lamar caught a spark, a barely noticeable movement, as if his words had reached her. She didn't say anything in response, but her silence was more eloquent than any answer. She walked to the nearest tree and leaned lightly on its trunk. Her movements were smooth and confident, as if she felt nothing but calm. But Lamar knew that this silence hid much more. He could feel the silence between them growing more intense, as her gaze became intense and penetrating. At that moment he realized that he could no longer hide his feelings, that he needed to explain to her everything that was going on inside him. As he took a step closer, he felt her warmth radiating from her like a light, barely perceptible fire. Lamar knew that these feelings for Ida could not be a simple infatuation, that it was not just an attraction. She was something completely new to him, a person who awakened in him all that he considered long forgotten.
Come on. I think I really like you, even more than just liking you.
Ida, hearing these words, did not change her expression. Her gaze remained as soft and calm, but her lips trembled slightly. She was standing so close that he could feel her breathing, hear her every breath. They were close, and there was something about that closeness that made him forget about everything. It seemed like the whole world had disappeared, leaving only her. Her presence filled his soul with peace, but at the same time it awakened an unbearable feeling of longing. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if weighing the words she had to say. Then her gaze settled on him again. There was a certain depth hidden behind the calmness, but Lamar couldn't figure out exactly what she was feeling. Her face remained calm, but he knew there was more to it than that.
Lamar, what you're feeling is temporary. We're here. This place makes us feel different.
Her words hit him like a cold rain. He understood that she was trying to shut him out, that for her it was just a fleeting feeling that would disappear when she returned to the city. But Lamar knew it wasn't just a hobby for him. These feelings grew every day, becoming a part of his life, and he couldn't just believe that it would pass. Her words seemed icy, but Lamar knew that he saw something else in her eyes. She wasn't telling him the whole truth, trying to protect him or herself, but her silence spoke volumes. They stood side by side, and each of them understood that it was impossible to just forget this feeling. He wanted to tell her that her words would not change anything, that he continued to feel this attraction, but Ida only nodded softly, pulling away. Lamar realized that she did not want to accept these feelings, that for her it seemed something inappropriate, wrong. Her demeanor remained restrained, but in this restraint he sensed her own doubts. He knew he couldn't make her believe what he was feeling, but this attempt to distance himself wouldn't change his attraction. When he left the park, the dark trees and the cold evening seemed even more gloomy to him. Lamar couldn't get rid of the thought that this woman had become something for him that would change him forever, that every evening, every conversation they had made him more attached. From the very morning, as soon as he woke up, Lamar felt more and more how his days at his grandmother's acquired a new, barely perceptible rhythm. He noticed how the surrounding space became more saturated, more filled with meaning, although nothing changed externally. The nature was the same. The trees were still rustling in the wind, the days were calm, but now they left him with a keen sense of expectation. A simple breakfast at the kitchen table, after which he went out into the garden. The warm light of the morning sun filling the old house, everything took on a new hue, because deep down he knew that he would soon meet her. Ida, his grandmother's friend, suddenly entered his life as if she had always been here. It was as if she walked with him along the same paths, breathed the same air, and filled the silence with a special harmony with her silent presence. Now every step he took in the garden or on the riverbank was sharpened by this inexplicable sense of her presence. Outwardly, there was no word or promise between them. Everything happened silently, as if it was a game that only they knew. He knew he shouldn't look for her eyes, but despite that, they met almost every day, and then their silence said everything. At first, these meetings seemed random. He just passed by her house when she was watering the plants in the garden, or standing quietly under the shade of the trees. It was as if she happened to be on the way. Her gaze fell on him, but her expression remained calm, detached, as if it were a simple welcome meeting. But Lamar began to notice how his heart reacted to her appearance, how his breathing became ragged as soon as he saw her figure in the distance. The more time passed, the more often he felt that Ida was becoming not just a pleasant companion, but something much more than he could realize or explain. This affection filled his days even when she was far away. On walks by the river, in the woods, in the gazebo, or just at home, where he spent his evenings alone, Lamar felt her invisible presence. He was looking for her gaze, waiting for her to appear, as if it were a part of himself. At first he tried to fight this feeling. It seemed to him that this was temporary, that his grandmother's friend was just a fleeting image, reminding him of the quiet life he had once left. But with each passing day, this idea became more and more untenable. He was attracted to her, and Lamar could no longer pretend not to notice it. She was there, and he found her everywhere, in every detail of their little world, in the sound of her footsteps, in the muffled laughter that came from her garden, and in her light gaze that followed him, as if casually. They bumped into each other more and more often on the tracks, as if by accident. When they met, there was a silence between them, filled with something more than words. Lamar found comfort in these looks, a strange calmness and anxiety at the same time. Ida, with her smooth gait, always kept a little distance, but it was this distance that gave his feelings a new, painful shade. She was there, but she never let herself cross the line. Her smile, calm, even voice and soft gaze created an aura of inaccessibility around her, and this only strengthened his feelings. When they met again by the river, where their favorite trail was, Lamar felt something change in his soul. Ida stood on the opposite bank, motionlessly watching the water flow. He did not dare to approach, but her presence attracted, filled the entire space around him. Lamar stood watching her figure, watching her every move, as if he was afraid that this moment would disappear as soon as he took a step. But she remained, as if nature itself had detained her in this place. And Lamar knew that these feelings had become a part of his life, that without them he could no longer imagine his existence here. Over time, their meetings began to occur more often, but they still did not talk to each other about what connects them. They were silent. Their silence became that invisible thread that connected them into a single whole. Sometimes Lamar noticed her in the garden among the flowers, where she was quietly going about her business, as if his presence did not matter to her. But every time she looked up at him, her gaze was full of something deep and inexplicable, and Lamar realized that this connection was stronger than they could admit. There were moments when it was as if a fire was burning between them, and neither of them dared to succumb to it. Her presence became like air to him, necessary but unattainable. Every evening when they met by chance in the park, on the paths or by the shore, he knew that these meetings gave his life a new meaning. In her presence he became himself, free from his worries and the past. He began to feel like a different person, ready to meet the feelings that seemed so simple and honest. But at the same time he understood that there was something irresistible between them, something that kept them on edge. Each of their meetings was filled with tension, and they both knew about it, but they were silent, as if they did not want to break this fragile harmony. Ida remained as calm and confident, her face reflected only a slight smile, but her every look, her every pause said more than words could express. It was as if she knew what was going on between them, but she maintained the same restraint, leaving him in agonizing suspense. Lamar searched for her in every moment of his days, in every morning wake-up and evening walk. He realized that this connection had become something so deep for him that he could no longer imagine himself without these meetings, without her presence, her calm gaze and quiet steps along the paths. Her image haunted him, filling his thoughts and his every breath, and he could no longer fight this feeling. Now every day was filled with expectation for him when he would see her again, even for a moment, even from afar. As the days passed, he knew that this attraction was becoming more and more unbearable. It was burning in his soul like a fire that could not be extinguished. Her image became for him not only a source of joy, but also a painful expectation, which intensified every day. He realized that this feeling was not just sympathy or attraction, it was something more. It was a part of himself. And he knew that he could no longer resist it, that every time they met, he was getting closer to the moment when he would have to admit that this woman had become something for him that changed his heart forever. Now every morning, every sunset, every evening brought him only one thing: the desire to see her again, to feel her presence, to enjoy her every movement, every look. Her light gait, soft gestures, her smile became for him what he woke up for, what filled his life with meaning. Every day their meetings left a deeper mark on Lamar's soul, but a painful feeling of mystery and secrecy began to weigh on him. In his eyes, Ida had long ceased to be just a friend of his grandmother. She had become a person to whom he was attracted with inexplicable force, and now he could no longer hide his feelings from himself. These feelings were quiet at first, like a light evening breeze, but now they resembled a storm raging inside, which demanded an exit. She became a meaning for him, a necessary part of his life in this place, although everything around remained the same. filled with tranquility and silence. But every time he returned to the house, he felt that he was bringing with him something inexpressible, in words a storm of emotions, mixed with the painful realization that these feelings might remain only a secret. As time passed, their meetings became more frequent. At first, it was random intersections, a light exchange of glances, a fleeting smile, every moment, as if randomly interrupting the monotony of the day. But now Lamar found himself looking for her every day, memorizing every detail, every gesture and look, as if every moment with her could be the last. Their silence took on a new meaning. It became an unchanging part of what had arisen between them, like an unspoken understanding, deep and personal. But it was in this silence that the tension grew, which became more and more unbearable. He didn't know how much longer he could hold back, but he was also afraid of the consequences of confessing. Lamar was completely at the mercy of his feelings, and every time he met Ida's gaze, this feeling grew, filled with a special meaning. Her figure flashing among the trees, her quiet gait and weightless presence became something akin to magic for him. But he understood that hidden attraction brings pain with it. Lamar wished he could just enjoy her presence, but his heart was already demanding more. And at these moments, the silence of the house, filled with the rustle of Grandma's footsteps and the sound of her voice, became frighteningly loud for him. He could not look his grandmother in the eye, feeling that he was betraying her trust and her care. Lamar knew that Ida was a person whom Estelle had long accepted into her life and into her heart, and this person had become someone incredibly important to him. But every time he thought about it, he was overcome by a strange feeling of guilt. He knew that for his grandmother, Ida was more than just a friend. She was a companion in life, a person who supported her when many had already left. And the realization that he had fallen in love with her seemed somehow unacceptable. His connection with Ida became something hidden, a mysterious ritual that filled his every day, but with it came a shadow of fear. He knew that one day his grandmother might realize that something much stronger than simple sympathy had arisen between him and her friend. There was a growing feeling in Lamar's heart that he was betraying not only his grandmother, but also himself, allowing these feelings to grow in the shadows. But he couldn't stop himself. Every time they met, their silence turned into the moment he lived for. One evening, when his grandmother asked him to help with the garden, he felt that his looks began to betray him. His heart was beating too fast, and every step he took, every glance towards his grandmother's house, was filled with guilt. Estelle's words pierced him like a reminder that Ida was not just someone random in their lives. She was part of his grandmother's story, and Lamar began to fear that his feelings could destroy everything that had been built over the years. He felt like he was between two fires. On the one hand, his love, on the other, his duty to his grandmother, her trust and her calmness. He was torn apart, feeling himself sinking more and more into the painful realization that every meeting with Ada was a step towards one day confessing everything to his grandmother. These thoughts began to poison his joy at meeting Ida. He was afraid that their connection, which they had so carefully concealed, would become obvious, that every moment they shared would be revealed. Lamar saw in Ida the strength and calmness that he had admired more than once, and he understood that she, too, was probably aware of the danger of their relationship. Their every look, every touch, although filled with tenderness, became painful from the realization of what they were doing. He understood that he would not be able to deceive his grandmother for a long time, that their feelings would come out one day, and he would have nowhere to hide. Every day Lamar noticed more and more that Ida, although responding to his feelings, was being careful. It was as if she was afraid that their connection would become obvious, and they would both be forced to admit that there was more between them than just friendship. Her gaze was full of restraint, her smile became less open, and her hands, which had previously touched him lightly in greeting, now barely noticeably lingered, as if she was trying to restrain herself from giving vent to her feelings. And the more he saw that hidden fear in her eyes, the more attracted he became to her. He wanted to break down this barrier, but he understood that her restraint was the last limit that protected them both from final recognition. Lamar realized that every day, every look and every gesture was a step towards the inevitable. They could no longer just be friends, they could not ignore the fact that their bond had become too strong, too deep a feeling that they both tried to hide, but which could not be suppressed. It was a love that couldn't be called out loud, that had to be hidden, and that made it all the more painful. But with each new meeting, he realized that he could no longer stay in the shadows. He needed to confess everything, to tell his grandmother the truth, even if it hurt, even if it destroyed the world they had all so carefully guarded. With each passing day, thoughts of recognition filled Lamar's head more and more, filling his every step with a sense of inevitability. The space of the house and garden, which had once seemed serene and safe to him, now seemed to hang over him like a mute but tangible barrier. He found himself starting to avoid talking to his grandmother, spending more and more time alone, where he allowed himself to immerse himself in his thoughts and conflicting feelings. His grandmother's looks, her calm kindness, seemed unbearable to him now. He could not look into her eyes, knowing that he was hiding something from her that for him had become the meaning of his days here. At first he tried to find an excuse for his feelings. He told himself that it was just an impulse caused by the silence of this place, the simplicity of their meetings with Ada. He tried to explain to himself that this impulse would pass, but every time he saw her, every new meeting, every intersection of their views destroyed this confidence. Ada became like a magnet for him, which attracted him not only by her appearance or calmness. She became something that filled his heart, which revived him again, but at the same time tormented him. Ida was like a forbidden fruit for him, which became more and more desirable every day. Her movements, her quiet smile, her manner of behaving with restraint but confidence, all this captivated him. He had seen her in the garden in the morning, tending the flowers. He had found traces of her in every detail of this house, and now every day without her seemed lost to him. But most of all, Lamar suffered from the fact that every moment with Ada was associated with guilt for him. Guilt in front of his grandmother became his constant companion. It burned him from the inside and tore his heart. He knew that Grandma cherished Ida not just as a friend. Ida became a part of their family, a part of her memories, the only one who stayed by their side when many had already left. Lamar was aware that their friendship was riddled with years of history, the memory of their experiences and the trust that cannot be broken. But no matter how hard he tried to pull away, to forget about his feelings, he still found himself thinking about her every day. Ida filled his thoughts, his dreams, and he couldn't just forget about it anymore. Every morning when he got up, he thought about how he would tell his grandmother the truth. He imagined her reaction, the severity she would have to face if he told her everything. He was afraid to think that she might not understand him, might see in him a traitor who had destroyed her world. But he could no longer hide the truth. His feelings were too strong, they overwhelmed him, and every day this silence became more and more unbearable for him. Lamar increasingly noticed how his grandmother looked at him, how her gaze lingered a little longer than usual, as if she understood that something was happening but could not figure out what exactly. He felt that she needed this explanation, that she was ready to hear the truth herself. But every time he tried to speak, the words stuck in his throat. He couldn't say it out loud, couldn't break the fragile calm that still lingered in their house. Meetings with Ida have become something special. They both knew that something was going on between them, but neither he nor she could put it into words. Their looks said more than their mouths could say. Ida saw his struggle, saw his torment, and seemed to understand how he felt. Her silence was a support for him, but also a reminder that this feeling cannot be called, that it must remain hidden. One evening, when they happened to be alone in the garden, Lamar felt that he could no longer contain his emotions. He looked at her. Her face was illuminated by the soft light of the moon. Her eyes looked at him calmly, but he felt that this calmness hid the same pain that he himself was experiencing. At that moment he realized that he could no longer hide the truth, that he needed to confess, tell everything, even if it hurt. The next day he began to prepare for a conversation with his grandmother. He spent the day alone, trying to find the right words that wouldn't hurt her, that would explain what he couldn't even explain to himself. He tried to imagine her reaction, her expression when she found out the truth. He knew that his grandmother would not be able to accept his feelings easily, that Ida was something sacred to her, that her friendship with her was a part of her life, a part of her past. Lamar felt that this conversation would be the most difficult for him in his life. He was thinking about how to talk about his feelings, how to explain that they were not something temporary, that it was not a fleeting attraction. He understood that his confession could change everything they had, that it could destroy their relationship. But the silence became unbearable, and he knew that he could no longer live in the shadows. In the evening, when Grandma was busy with dinner, he realized that the time had come. He gathered his thoughts, his heart was pounding, and he felt a chill running down his back. He sat down at the table and waited for his grandmother to finish her business, feeling that every minute of waiting was becoming torture. Lamar knew that this conversation would be a point of no return for him, and he could not predict what its outcome would be. When Grandma sat down next to him, her face was as calm as ever, but in her eyes he saw something that reminded him of her wisdom, her patience and the love she always gave him. He knew that her answer would determine his future, that he would no longer be able to hide the truth and live the way he used to. When Lamar finally decided to talk to his grandmother, fear and determination were bubbling in his soul. It was as if he was moving through a thick fog, realizing that this evening would be a turning point for his life. Perhaps it would bring something final that could not be changed. His heart was beating so loudly that it seemed even the walls of the old house could catch its beats. He tried to collect his thoughts, to remember all the words he had memorized in the silence of the last few days, but now they were mixed up, leaving only a sense of the great importance of the upcoming conversation. Lamar did not know if he would be able to fully convey to her the whole truth that he was hiding, but he was ready to risk everything to free himself from the weight that threatened to engulf him. The evening was calm, as it always is in this house, but today the atmosphere felt different. Tension was in the air, making even the most familiar things seem alien. Grandma was sitting at the table, her face focused but calm. She looked at him, and there was so much understanding in that look that Lamar felt very small for a moment. He could almost see in her eyes the echoes of his entire past, when she was his support, mentor, and closest person, and this thought caused him a sharp sense of pain. He knew that his every thought, every emotion was obvious to her, as if she understood him more deeply than he did. His words began to come out with difficulty. He felt his throat constrict with excitement. Lamar began to speak, choosing his words carefully, but his every sentence sounded like a distant echo. He tried to explain to his grandmother that his feelings for Ida had become something more than just sympathy. He said that this woman had taken an important place in his heart, that she was the one who helped him find himself anew. Lamar did not look at his grandmother, fearing to see disappointment in her eyes, but in her silence he sensed something that told him that she already knew what he was talking about. With each word, Lamar felt his heart getting lighter, but the pain did not go away. He understood that his grandmother might be disappointed, that she might never forgive him for this confession. And yet he continued, knowing that he could not hide this feeling. He told her how every day spent with Ida filled him with new meaning, how their silent meetings became a source of inspiration and peace for him. He confessed that he could no longer live with this burden, that this feeling could not remain hidden, and he had to open it up to her. Grandma continued to listen without interrupting, and in this silence he felt her understanding. She expressed neither surprise nor condemnation. Her gaze remained as calm as ever, but Lamar could see that there was an inexpressible sadness hiding in her eyes. He knew he was hurting her, that his revelation was breaking the bond they had been building for years. But he also saw that his grandmother understood him, that her love for him was still alive, despite everything. When Lamar finished, his voice trailed off, and silence fell in the room. It seemed like an eternity before his grandmother spoke. But instead of words, she just took his hand. Her gesture was simple, but filled with endless meaning. Lamar felt in her touch all the tenderness that she had kept for him all these years, all the acceptance that he was so afraid of losing. Her hand was warm, but in her eyes he saw a strange, painful expression that he could not decipher. He realized that his confession was a heavy blow to her, but in this silent gesture he felt her boundless acceptance and love. She looked at him for a long time. Her gaze was sad, but Lamar saw that there was no condemnation in her eyes. She seemed to forgive him, realizing that his love for Ida was more than just a feeling. There was the wisdom of a man who had lived a long life and seen a lot in her eyes, and Lamar realized that she accepted him no matter what. He couldn't believe that she could let him go so easily, accept so easily what was tearing him apart. But Grandma just nodded, her eyes glistening with tears that she was trying to hide, and Lamar realized that her tacit agreement was all he needed. Grandma got up. Her steps were slow, as if she was carrying the brunt of this conversation. Her face remained calm, but Lamar saw her shoulders slump slightly, as if his words had taken away some of her vitality. He knew he had hurt her, but he understood that she accepted him for who he was, with his feelings and his choices. Her love was what gave him strength, and he knew that her understanding was all he needed to carry on. When she left the room, leaving him alone, Lamar felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He knew that their relationship would no longer be the same as before, that their bond was now filled with something new and unexplored. But he also realized that their love had deepened, that her forgiveness had freed him from all doubt and fear.
If that were really the case, I would tell you about it. I think you already know that my morning walks are not just for me.
Lamar froze for a moment, looking at her, feeling her words pierce him and leave a mark, as if exposing his own feelings, which he tried hard to hide even from himself.
So I'm not the only one looking for peace here.
She laughed, softly, barely perceptibly, and her laugh sounded to him like an unexpected touch, bringing him back to life.
You know the answer. We all seek peace, especially where it is most difficult to find. It's just that sometimes we don't fully realize it.
He took a step closer, his feet barely touching the ground, as if he was afraid to destroy the magic of the moment. Every morning began for him with the hope of her appearance, and now he could not believe that he was really standing here next to her.
I never thought before that a walk through the forest could bring so much. Silence. It seems easier to be yourself here.
Ida looked at him thoughtfully. Her gaze was searching, as if she was trying to figure out exactly what was hidden behind his words.
Are you sure it's just the forest?
Her words touched something in his soul, and he looked away, as if he was afraid that she would read in his eyes what he did not dare to say. It seemed to him that her questions were much deeper than they seemed at first glance.
You're right. Maybe it's not just the silence of the forest. This place seems to change everything around, as if it makes you see what was hidden.
She took a step toward him, softly, almost noiselessly, and her voice sounded low, like the wind whispering among the trees.
We always see what we want to see, Lamar. And it seems you didn't come here just for peace.
His heart began to pound harder, and he was silent for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts. He realized that her words had awakened a strange excitement in him, as if she saw through him, knew how he felt.
Sometimes I think you're reading my mind. It's like you know more about me than I do.
She smiled slightly, mysteriously, as if there was some secret meaning in her smile, and her eyes became even deeper, as if reflecting all the wisdom of the forest around them.
It's easier to understand the other person here. We are not just talking in words here. Sometimes silence tells more.
These words caused Lamar embarrassment, but also a strange, quiet happiness. He knew she was right, their communication needed no words, as if an invisible bond had been established between them that needed no explanation. But his desire to tell her something important, something real, was too strong for him to resist.
Have you ever felt that someone is becoming more important to you than you can afford?
Ida did not look away. Her eyes were filled with a soft light, but something else flashed in them, something warm but restrained.
We all face this sooner or later, but sometimes what seems unacceptable turns out to be what gives us strength.
A strange determination gripped him. He felt that this moment was his only chance to find out the truth, to express what tormented him, and at the same time inspired him.
Ida, since I came here, I can't get rid of the thought that you are not just my grandmother's friend.
She smiled faintly, and a sparkle flashed in her eyes, as if she had been waiting for these words. Her calmness and confidence made him feel both vulnerable and admired.
And what does that mean to you?
A fever seized him, and he realized that he could no longer hide his feelings. The words that he had been holding back all this time finally escaped his lips.
I do not know how to explain it. Every day you become something more to me. Your presence here in this forest, your words, your look, all this fills me with a feeling that I cannot escape.
Her face remained calm, but he noticed how her gaze softened, as if her heart responded to his words. There was something warm but hidden in her expression, as if she herself was trying not to succumb to these emotions.
We often don't realize what we are looking for. And perhaps meeting someone who becomes important to us always puts us in front of a choice that we did not expect.
Lamar felt that her words were an answer to his own feelings. He didn't know how far he could go, but his heart yearned to know her answer. He took another step toward her, and her breath seemed to merge with his.
I'm afraid that one day this feeling will destroy me. But at the same time, I'm afraid of losing him.
Ida looked at him without taking her eyes off him, and her gaze was full of the very warmth he craved. She seemed to accept his words as something natural, as if they had been known to her for a long time.
Maybe this feeling is not destruction, but the beginning of something new. Sometimes what we consider dangerous actually becomes something that allows us to see our own essence.
Lamar took a deep breath, realizing that he could no longer ignore his feelings. Her words made his heart skip a beat, as if she was revealing to him the truth that he had been trying to hide for so long. It seemed to him that he had finally seen what he had been looking for so long.
I can't lie to myself anymore. You are what makes my life here meaningful. You are the silence that I wanted to find so much.
Ida seemed to understand his feelings, but her face remained calm, as if she was trying to suppress her own emotions. Her voice was low, but there was a subtle tenderness in it.
You can find silence alone, Lamar. But this feeling, it's yours. It should become a part of you, no matter what connects us.
Lamar fell silent, realizing that her words did not reject him, but they did not promise anything either. Her forgiveness, her calm acceptance, was like salvation for him. But he knew that their relationship would now exist beyond words and promises. They stood opposite each other, surrounded by the forest, which seemed to have witnessed their conversation. The silence around them was filled with feelings they couldn't express, and in that silence Lamar found what he was looking for. Lamar, standing on the threshold of the morning forest, could not get rid of the feeling that his every movement and every breath was like an invisible thread connecting him to her. It was difficult to explain even to himself, but Ida became a part of his everyday. He woke up early, before his grandmother, and went to the river with the only hope to meet her. These meetings, seemingly random but always exciting, were the only thing that gave his day meaning. He found her now at the bend of the path, now on the very shore, and every time his heart stopped when their eyes met. This morning was no exception. The sun's rays made their way through the crowns of the trees, laying golden stripes on the wet grass, and in this light Lamar noticed her silhouette again. She was standing a little way off the path, lost in her thoughts, and he, afraid of scaring her off, stopped and watched.
I'm sorry if I'm disturbing your morning solitude again.
Ida turned to him with a soft smile, and there was something in her gaze that he could not immediately understand, a mixture of interest and some kind of quiet, almost wise acceptance. Lamar tried to focus on his morning walks, but thoughts of her kept coming back. He tried to convince himself that their meetings were just a coincidence, that his attraction would pass like a spring storm, noisily but quickly. But these thoughts became only a weak shield against the growing interest in Ida. Every chance meeting between them, every glance of hers, or a brief exchange of words left a trace in him that did not disappear, but on the contrary became deeper and deeper. At times he held his pace, running his eyes over the space around, unconsciously looking for her among the trees or in the garden near the house. At such moments he found himself waiting for his heart to stop, and his mind was insistently telling him to stop. But Lamar couldn't. Something stronger than him, some quiet call, pushed him every day to places where he could see her. By the river, on the very path where they had first met, he now spent more time than anywhere else. It was as if he had turned into a silent observer of nature, but in fact he was attracted not by the river, not by the rustle of leaves, not by clean air, but by the thought that one day, on one of these days, Ida would pass by again. And when it really happened one day, he felt his heart stop. She walked along the path with a light gait, gliding and graceful, as if she did not touch the ground. Lamar, noticing her from afar, took a few steps towards her, but something elusive slowed him down, forcing him to stop, as if at the last moment something restrained him from haste. He stood frozen, watching Ida get closer and closer to him. He saw her face, calm and focused, her gaze fixed forward, and then their eyes met. She smiled slightly, and that look sent a wave through his body that was impossible to contain. She looked at him as if she had read his mind, as if she understood that at this moment he saw her not just as a casual acquaintance, or as a friend of his grandmother. There was no reproach in her gaze, no condemnation, but it seemed to Lamar that at that moment she saw through him. His first impulse was to leave, to hide from that penetrating gaze, but her calmness seemed to paralyze him again. They met in the middle of the path. He was almost afraid to break this silence, so full of meaning, but as always, Ida was the first to break the silence. There was a note of soft irony in her voice.
It's like you're drawn back here every morning. Maybe you found something special here.
Lamar, feeling her gaze, felt his lips involuntarily form a slight smile. She didn't ask directly, but there was a subtle hint in her voice that she knew the answer.
I don't know. It seems that this place is like a magnet. It brings peace like nothing else.
Ida tilted her head to the side, her dark eyes twinkling under the sunlight falling through the leaves. He couldn't figure out what that look of hers meant, curiosity, irony, or something else she was carefully hiding behind that expression.
You could find peace in the city. Do you really need to be here?
Her words seemed simple, but Lamar sensed a challenge in them. He didn't know how to answer this question, which revealed feelings in him that he didn't want to talk about.
Maybe I needed an excuse to stay. This place gives me a feeling that I haven't felt in a long time.
She didn't take her eyes off him. There was a quiet concentration in her eyes. He almost wanted to say more, something that would outline his inner struggle, but instead he just shrugged. Lamar realized that he was afraid to open up to her, fearing that his words would be too frank. As if admitting his feelings, he was losing something intimate. However, Ida didn't seem to need his words. She came closer, their eyes met again, and Lamar felt that, despite all the distance between them, they were closer than he had ever felt with another person. They stood there, and it seemed to Lamar that time had stopped. He saw her dark eyes, deep, as if beckoning to an unknown depth, and he was seized with a sharp feeling of longing.
Is something bothering you? Or is it just my imagination?
Her words were spoken almost in a whisper, as if she was afraid to break this tacit agreement that had been established between them. Lamar couldn't hide his emotions anymore, but he still felt the words getting stuck in his throat.
Ida, sometimes I feel like I shouldn't be here, that I'm invading your life, disturbing your peace of mind.
Ida only smiled slightly, and her gaze became softer, as if she understood his feelings and accepted them. It seemed that she could unravel his doubts, sense his anxiety.
If that were the case, I would tell you. But you're not breaking anything, Lamar. Rather, you remind me that simple meetings can be more important than words.
Her words echoed in him, as if she had pushed him to the realization he had been avoiding for so long. Lamar realized that their silence was not an emptiness, but a special form of communication filled with what both of them could not express in words. They continued walking along the path, occasionally meeting eyes, and this silence turned into something much more for him. He felt her closeness, her warmth, as if her presence was the only thing that filled his soul. He wanted to talk, but he was afraid to ruin this moment. In the end, his state of mind turned into a sweet, painful tension. Later that evening, Lamar sat on the terrace of his grandmother's house, mentally replaying their conversation. He was aware that Ida knew more than she was saying, that her words were heartfelt and filled with understanding. She sensed his confusion and accepted him as he was. He felt scared, because every time he saw her, their connections became more and more significant, as if it was his inevitable vocation to strive for her, to stay close, even if it would lead him to the edge. And again the morning came. Again Lamar felt an unbearable desire to see her inside himself, although he knew perfectly well that this would only complicate his own experiences. They met again by the river, and Ida, with the same calm expression on her face, walked towards him, not hiding her confidence. This time they stood on the shore, silently watching the reflection of the trees and the water that flowed past, unhurriedly and calmly.
Tell me, have you ever felt that you are attracted to something or someone, even if you understand that it is unreasonable?
She gave him a long, attentive look, and her face became serious. She understood his question, his uncertainty and fear.
Yes, it happened. Sometimes life confronts us with people who evoke something important in us. Even if we know that such feelings should not go further, they may be necessary for us.
These words startled Lamar. Ida did not turn away, she answered honestly, but her eyes remained closed for understanding, as if she did not want to show how she felt. In her words, he heard some hint that her own feelings for him might not be so simple.
I'm afraid that one day I'll do something that I'll regret. But when I'm with you, it seems to me that this is the right thing to do.
Ida looked down and smiled, but in her smile there was a shadow of sadness.
Maybe it's true. Maybe all we have to do is go for what feels right, even if it hurts.
Lamar didn't know what to say. Her words pierced him like a cold wind, but he understood that this was their reality. Silence and understanding mixed with a feeling they both tried to deny. The evenings at his grandmother's house were a challenge for Lamar. Every time he was with her, he felt the weight of guilt filling him with the realization that something more than just friendship was being formed between him and Ida. It seemed to him that he noticed an invisible knowledge in her gaze, as if his grandmother suspected something, but he did not dare to ask her directly. This indecision gave rise to anxiety in him, but he remained silent, afraid to break the calm relationship that had been between them since childhood. Grandma was a wise and patient woman. Her kind eyes did not express the slightest hint of suspicion or jealousy, but it seemed that her intuition, accumulated over the years, sees through her grandson. There was endless love and care in her light smile and warm gestures with which she surrounded Lamar, and every time he felt like a traitor who allowed his feelings for her friend to flare up so uncontrollably. From morning to evening, he tried to immerse himself in simple things to distract himself from his thoughts. He cleaned the yard, helped his grandmother with the housework, went out into the forest for firewood, but his attention involuntarily returned each time to those meetings by the river, to Ada's fleeting glances, and to the silence filled with a special meaning. The internal struggle became more and more palpable for him. He knew that he felt something more than just an ordinary attraction to Ida, but he couldn't admit it to himself either. How could he allow himself such thoughts when every evening his grandmother, with whom he was so close, looked at him with trust? One day during dinner, Grandma, while serving food, said that Ida was inviting them to her house for dinner. This news took him by surprise. His grandmother's familiar voice and her sincere joy puzzled him. Lamar felt something twitch inside, as if his secret was about to be revealed. Grandma also offered to take a small gift with her to bake a pie that they could bring to Ida. Lamar couldn't refuse, because that would be too suspicious. His whole being protested, but he nodded, knowing that he could not refuse. He felt strangely restless all day, and his grandmother, on the contrary, was cheerfully busy in the kitchen, as if it were an ordinary event. Her joy and kindness only increased his guilt. He imagined the evening at Ida's, the moment when he would see her again, but now not alone, but in the presence of his grandmother, and this thought haunted him. It seemed to him that every glance, every smile of Ida would cause new waves of embarrassment in him, which he would not be able to hide. The evening came quickly, and Lamar, trying to hide his excitement, followed his grandmother when they went to Ada's house. Her cozy home, impregnated with a slight smell of fresh herbs and flowers, greeted them warmly and cordially. Ida, in a simple but elegant dress, came out to them with a soft smile, and her gaze, which met Lamar's, awakened in him the very feelings that he was so desperately trying to get rid of. She greeted them with such ease that for a moment it seemed to him that everything that was happening was just a figment of his imagination, that his feelings for her were nothing more than a delusion. They sat down at the table, and the conversation flowed smoothly about everyday affairs, about the garden, about the past summer, about the coming cold weather. Ida seemed to speak simply, with restraint, but her every word, every look made Lamar feel uncomfortable. He was afraid that his grandmother would notice this, that she would sense something strange in their communication, catch the invisible connection that had arisen between him and Ada. However, Grandma, immersed in conversation, was discussing with Ida with lively interest her new plans for the garden, and Lamar relaxed a little, feeling that his worries might be just a figment of his imagination. At some point, Ida got up to pour tea, and her light movements again attracted Lamar's attention. Her graceful gait, as always, was imbued with that elusive confidence and calmness that attracted him so much. He could feel the tension growing inside him again, and he tried to hide it by focusing on his grandmother's conversation. But his attention kept returning to Ida. One glance from her, one casual movement, was enough for him to lose his composure again. This evening turned out to be a test for him, which he barely survived. Every time his gaze fell on Ida, he felt an irresistible longing awaken in him, a desire that he could not speak out loud. He looked at his grandmother, her face full of kindness and love, and realized that he had to fight this feeling, suppress it, but his heart no longer obeyed his mind. He felt something inside him tearing apart, as he was attracted to Ida more and more, and despite all his attempts to cope with himself, he realized that he could no longer ignore his feelings. After that evening, Lamar tried to avoid grandmother's questions, although he understood that she might suspect something. Her gazes became more intense, sometimes lingering on him longer than usual. At such moments he felt awkward and left under the pretext of some business, just to avoid making eye contact with her. This secrecy was destroying him from the inside, but he did not find the strength to open up. Lamar understood that he had gone too far, that his feelings for Ida had become something inevitable for him, but he could not leave his grandmother, who sincerely believed in his honesty and devotion. Every day Lamar felt more and more clearly that his feelings for Ida could not be suppressed. They grew like a flame that could not be extinguished. His affection for his grandmother held him back, but he knew that sooner or later this internal struggle would find its resolution. He could leave, go back to the city, leaving behind this rural idyll and his impossible love. But the thought of returning to the city seemed unbearable to him. Now that he has met Ida, his former life has lost its appeal, has become something distant and meaningless. In the evenings he went to the river and sat on the shore for a long time, watching the water, trying to find inner peace. But these walks, instead of calming him down, only increased his confusion. In every shadow of the trees he saw her image, in the rustle of the leaves he heard her voice. His thoughts kept returning to Ida, and he could no longer imagine a morning without her presence, without a chance meeting on the path, or at her house. His whole life here at his grandmother's house was now permeated with her image, and the more he tried to get rid of these thoughts, the more they took hold of him. Every morning, starting from the moment he got out of bed, Lamar felt that his day was filled with anticipation of meeting Ida again. He couldn't control his excitement, every step he took was directed at her, to the moment when he would see her again and be able to meet her gaze for at least a moment. These feelings became something unbearable for him, but he could not find a way to get rid of them. It seemed to him that Ida saw his struggle, that she understood what feelings he had for her, but she did not say anything, remaining the same calm and detached. Her silence was unbearable for him, but at the same time it gave him a space in which he could feel safe. He knew that her tacit acceptance allowed him to be honest with himself without needing explanations or words. With each new meeting, their silent communication became deeper. They didn't need words to understand each other, and Lamar felt that this invisible connection was the only thing that supported him in this internal struggle. Their silence became a shelter for him, in which he could hide his feelings without fear of condemnation. Grandma seemed to see that something had changed in Lamar. She looked at him more and more often, with a slight reproach in her eyes, as if waiting for some explanation from him. He knew he couldn't hide his feelings anymore, but the fear of destroying what they had was holding him back. His grandmother became a part of his life for him. Her support and care were what he built his relationship with the world on, and he was afraid that the truth might ruin it all. Lamar felt that every day he was here was a step towards an inevitable choice. His feelings for Ida became a painful shadow for him, which he could not banish from his life, and his relationship with his grandmother became part of this shadow. He realized that he would not be able to hide his feelings for long, that sooner or later he would have to make a decision and either stay or leave. Every evening, returning home, Lamar felt his love for Ida growing stronger, and he could no longer hide it from himself. With each passing day, the internal conflict in Lamar's soul became more painful. Ida occupied all his thoughts, and he could no longer deny that this feeling had completely engulfed him. But every time he thought about her, he felt a tight loop of guilt tightening around his heart. It seemed to him that he was betraying his grandmother, who surrounded him with care and trust. This woman, who had always been by his side, now became an involuntary obstacle for him, as if her presence alone kept him on the edge, which he did not dare to step over. Lamar could almost physically feel his soul being torn apart by two strong feelings: affection for his grandmother and an impossible attraction to Ida. It was a strange, painful contradiction, as if he was between two worlds, each of which called to him, but neither of them allowed him to find peace. His life turned into an expectation. Every morning began with the hope of seeing Ida, and the evening ended with remorse when he looked at his grandmother, who still remained for him the embodiment of wisdom and warmth. He tried to convince himself that his feelings for Ida were just a fleeting attraction caused by temporary intimacy, that as soon as he returns to the city, all this will disappear, and his life will return to its former course. But the more he tried to suppress his emotions, the stronger the attraction became, as if resistance only increased the internal tension. In the moments when he stood by the river or strolled along familiar paths, his heart desperately longed for her quiet, confident presence, for her gaze in which, as it seemed to him, the whole world was reflected. Over time, Lamar began to avoid his grandmother, as if her presence increased his torment. He felt that every touch of hers, every warm look, reminded him that he was keeping a secret from her that would not leave him alone. Having dinner with her was a challenge. He avoided her gaze, tried not to engage in conversation, and most often was dissuaded by fatigue, after which he quickly retreated, trying to find at least a little privacy. Grandma seemed to feel something but didn't ask. She just continued to look at him with the same warmth and understanding, which only increased his inner torment. Every time Lamar returned from a meeting with Ida, he felt a sharp sense of guilt. It was like a forbidden fruit sweet, but poisoning his soul. He understood that this secret fire that burned his heart could not exist next to his grandmother, that her presence in itself rejected his feelings, as if her wisdom and steadfastness opposed his weakness. He was thinking more and more often that perhaps the only way to get rid of this pain was to just leave everything behind and try to forget Ida. But the thought was becoming unbearable for him. He knew he couldn't leave her, couldn't leave this village soaked in her image. Sometimes he tried to imagine what would happen if his grandmother found out the truth. He saw her disappointment, the heaviness in her eyes that would tell him about betrayal, and this picture became a real nightmare for him. His grandmother was always an example of strength and perseverance for him. She was the one who supported him when everything seemed lost. And now, by violating her trust, he felt that he was betraying her love, her faith in him. He began to notice that his grandmother sometimes sighed softly in his presence, as if her heart was gripped by a vague premonition. She didn't say anything, but her silence seemed to be filled with an understanding that she didn't want to put into words. This silence weighed on Lamar even more, as if the invisible bond between them was beginning to collapse under the weight of his secrets. It seemed to him that every evening they spent together brought the moment of truth closer, when he would have to reveal the whole truth to his grandmother. Sometimes he would sit alone for a long time in the garden, far from home, peering into the dark crowns of the trees. It seemed to him that this silence of nature was the only place where he could be honest with himself without fear of condemnation. At these moments he was tormented by the thought that he would no longer be able to remain in the shadows, that his feelings for Ida would become obvious, and he would not be able to hide anything. He understood that sooner or later this passion would break out, destroying his calm, familiar life. When Lamar faced Ida, it became a celebration and torture for him at the same time. She was still looking at him with a slight smile, and there was that calmness and restraint in her eyes that he had never seen in other women. She seemed unaffected by his torment, although he sometimes noticed something in her gaze that made his heart beat faster. Ida understood that something more was growing between them, but her behavior remained unchanged. This confidence of hers, her ability to keep her distance, delighted him and at the same time caused him pain. On nights when he couldn't sleep, Lamar often replayed the moments he spent with Ada. Her every glance, every casual touch was imprinted in his mind, becoming a source of inspiration and fear for him. He understood that there was more than just friendship in those moments, but still he couldn't bring himself to take a step that would change everything. He was tormented by conflicting feelings. On the one hand, he wanted to open up to her, tell her about what was boiling in his soul, and on the other hand, he understood that this would mean the end of the connection that he had so carefully guarded. His whole life turned into a painful expectation. He lived from one meeting with Ida to another, feeling more and more that this feeling was becoming a necessity for him. He knew that these meetings could not be continued, that he had to find the strength to stop, but despite all his efforts, he continued to look for her gaze, hoping for a chance meeting, for her silent smile. Every morning began with the thought that he would see her again, and this hope became for him something akin to salvation, but also a source of unbearable tension. With the onset of cold weather, when the trees lost their leaves and the days became shorter, Lamar felt that his inner conflict was escalating. Now that the house and garden looked empty and silent, his feeling for Ida seemed to him even more acute and contradictory. He went into the woods more and more often, hoping that physical fatigue would drown out his thoughts, but this only briefly distracted him from the storm that was raging inside. The less opportunity there was to meet Ida, the more his heart yearned for her. Every morning he felt that his days here were limited, that he would have to leave soon, but this thought became almost painful for him. How could he just leave it all behind? How could he leave knowing that he would never see her again? It seemed to him that every day his love for Ida became something inevitable, like breathing, and now she filled his life, leaving no room for other feelings. This bond between them, however tacit, was becoming a salvation for him that he could not afford. From time to time, when he was with his grandmother, it seemed to him that she already guessed about his feelings. She sometimes looked at him with a slight sadness, as if she was trying to understand what was going on in his soul, but did not ask questions. This unspoken understanding was a painful reminder for Lamar that he would not be able to hide forever. He knew that one day he would have to make a choice, and that choice would have consequences that he could not predict. Increasingly, he was gripped by a strange feeling that he was living on the edge between a dream and reality, that his life had turned into a mirage that could disappear at any moment. He tried to find solace in everyday activities, but even the simplest activities, like gardening or taking care of the house, could not distract his thoughts. It seemed to him that his every step, every movement brought him closer to the inevitable decision. But he did not know how to accept it. Gradually, Lamar began to realize that he could no longer avoid his grandmother, that her kindness and love were the only things that kept him from utter despair. But at the same time, he realized that the truth would come out anyway, that his feelings for Ida could not be hidden. And even though his heart went out to her, he knew that every time they met, it was the last reminder for him that he was on the brink. This double life, filled with hidden feelings and inner tension, became unbearable for him. In recent days, Lamar has increasingly felt the inevitability of an upcoming conversation with his grandmother. He could no longer evade her gaze, filled with patience and tenderness, but now with a hint of barely perceptible understanding. It seemed to him that her every glance and soft smile told him that she already guessed his secret feelings for Ida, that her patience was just a silent request to be honest. Her motionless calmness weighed on him, making him feel even more guilty and confused. He understood that his grandmother expected the truth from him, but he was afraid to destroy her faith in him. Every time he tried to talk to his grandmother about his feelings, the words stuck in his throat, preventing them from escaping. He already knew that he couldn't hide it from her for long, that the silence had become unbearable for him, but the fear of her reaction held him down. He couldn't help but think that her friendship with Ida wasn't just a casual acquaintance. These were years of trust, endless conversations, joys and sorrows that they shared with each other, maintaining a connection that went deeper than ordinary human attachments. Lamar felt that with his confession he was invading this long-standing, time-honored friendship, destroying something important and intimate. His anxiety grew by the minute. He felt like a stranger in his own home, where everything reminded him of the simple and familiar days when his life was defined and calm. His grandmother's care and tolerance now turned into a source of painful shame for him. And her presence in the house, her willingness to forgive any weakness of his, pushed him even more to the need for recognition. Every dinner, every conversation together about simple things turned into torture for him. He could barely look at his grandmother, feeling that he was holding something inside him that could destroy their unity. One day, waking up in the early morning, he decided to spend the day alone to try to collect his thoughts. All day he wandered through the forest, going deeper and deeper, trying to regain his mental balance. But this journey only increased his confusion. It seemed to him that the forest surrounding him was a reflection of his inner state, dense, confusing, full of dark shadows, among which he could not find a way out. He knew that he could no longer live with this oppressive feeling, that his confession would be an inevitable step towards liberation. When he returned home, he found his grandmother busy with the usual evening chores, and felt afraid again. He didn't want to hurt her, but he couldn't afford to hide the truth any longer. Now he felt that every evening they spent together, every casual touch or glance, was becoming more and more unbearable, that their common life here, in the silence of the village house, had become a trap for him. Lamar realized that silence is no longer a defense, but has become a barrier that separates him and his grandmother. He spent the next day anxiously waiting. The words he wanted to say to his grandmother were endlessly spinning in his head, but each of them seemed to him not strong enough to express everything that was happening inside him. He imagined her expression, her silent look when she found out the truth, and his heart ached. Lamar understood that his confession could be a blow to her, that his grandmother might not be able to accept his feelings for Ida, but he knew that it was impossible to hide it further. By evening he felt that the time had come. They sat down at the table, and Grandma, noticing his tension, looked at him with a quiet kindness that was like a knife blade to him. Her eyes, full of understanding, seemed to say to him, "I'm waiting." Lamar understood that there was no point in dragging it out any further. His heart was beating so hard that it seemed to him that she could hear every beat of it, but he gathered all his strength to finally speak the truth that burned inside him. The words came out unevenly, intermittently. He could not find the right phrases, and his grandmother silently looked at him. There was neither condemnation nor surprise in her gaze, only quiet understanding. He tried to explain to her that his feelings for Ida were not just a passing infatuation, that this woman had become for him someone who brought him back to life, who filled his soul with the meaning he had been looking for so long. He admitted that he could not suppress this feeling, that every day of their meetings became a salvation for him, but also a torment. As he said this, he felt like he was relieving himself of the weight that lay on his heart. He knew that this moment would be a turning point for him, that his relationship with his grandmother would no longer be the same, that he would no longer be able to live in her house as before. Her forgiveness, her acquiescence was the only possible outcome he had hoped for. He knew that it could break the bond that united them, but now the truth was more important to him. When he finished speaking, there was a long silence in the room. Lamar couldn't look up, expecting the worst. It seemed to him that the silence stretched for an eternity, that every moment of it became a test, but he felt his grandmother come up to him and just put her hand on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it had everything he was afraid of losing. Lamar felt her support and pain at the same time, as if her touch was both forgiveness and bitterness at the same time. Her eyes remained calm, but there was a glint of sadness in them that he couldn't help but notice. He understood that her forgiveness was an act of love that was not easy for her. Her wisdom and patience were like an anchor in the sea for him, which did not allow him to get lost, and now he felt that he had betrayed that trust. But there was that calmness in her eyes that he appreciated so much, and it comforted him, as if, despite everything, she accepted his choice. Grandma was silent for a long time before she spoke, and there was no anger or disappointment in her voice, only a quiet sadness. She said that Ida was her friend, a reliable support, the person with whom she shared the joys and difficulties for many years. But as always, her words were not a reproach, just a gentle reminder of how much she trusted both him and Ida. Lamar knew that her acceptance was not an easy decision, that there was pain behind her words, but it was also a testament to the love she gave him unconditionally. That night was a moment of liberation and sadness for him. He understood that now their relationship with his grandmother had changed, that her forgiveness gave him the right to follow his feelings, but at the same time imposed on him a new responsibility. He knew that their conversation had left a wound in his grandmother's heart, but he was grateful for her wisdom and fortitude. Now he had to meet Ida with the understanding that his love for her had become part of his past and future, part of the world that he and his grandmother shared. After a difficult conversation with his grandmother, Lamar felt as if he was liberated, but at the same time devastated. He no longer felt the weight of the mystery, was not constrained by her silent understanding, and did not hide from her gaze. Her forgiveness had given him the right to his own feelings, but now a new reality was opening up in front of him, in which he had to accept his choice and, perhaps, build another life. He no longer had anything to hide, either from his grandmother or from himself. He felt a strange calmness mixed with a subtle sadness. The realization that their relationship with his grandmother had changed forever added a touch of bitterness to his joy. In the following days, Lamar became more and more drawn to solitude. He went to the river, took a long walk through the forest, allowed himself to stop and think. He understood that talking to his grandmother was just the beginning of a journey, the beginning of something that did not have precise outlines. He had to sort out his own feelings, accept them as something true and important, which now not only defined his life, but also changed it. He knew that the past would now remain in the past, but despite this, he felt that everything that had happened had left an imprint on him that he would never be able to erase. Now his thoughts kept returning to Ida, and every day he felt her image come to life in his mind. She became something immutable for him, that bright memory that attracted him and at the same time scared him. He thought about what their meeting would look like, what she would say when she found out that his feelings were not just a fleeting infatuation, but a deep affection that made her a part of his life. Lamar knew that a difficult conversation was ahead of him, which should either bring them closer or put an end to it. In the evening, he finally decided to go to Ida's. He felt that this conversation would be no less important to him than the revelation in front of his grandmother, but despite his excitement, he needed this release. He knew that if he didn't talk to her, his doubts and hopes would remain just phantoms, a shadow on the wall. As he approached her house, he felt strangely calm, as if everything he had to say had already been decided, and he only had to say it out loud. When Ida opened the door for him, he saw a slight surprise in her eyes, but also a warmth that immediately filled his heart. Lamar felt that this evening would be something special for them, a moment when they could finally talk honestly about what had happened between them, without hiding behind silence and without looking away. He greeted her with restraint, trying to hide his excitement, but Ida seemed to understand everything and invited him in. They were sitting opposite each other in her small living room, surrounded by candlelight, which gave everything a certain mystery. Ida looked at him calmly. There was a calm readiness in her gaze, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, just like him. Their conversation was unhurried, filled with that deep, almost invisible intimacy that could only arise between people who had long understood each other without words. Lamar began to talk about how he felt her presence in his life, how her calm and confident gaze became something unchangeable for him, as if he found in her eyes what he had been looking for all his life. He talked about how meeting her changed him, made him reconsider his existence and realize that she had become a part of himself. The words were simple, but Ida seemed to accept each of them with the calmness that had always been characteristic of her. She listened without interrupting, but her eyes reflected the depth of feelings that she hid, leaving behind her usual smile and calmness. When Lamar told her about his feelings, about how he woke up every morning thinking about her, Ida only nodded slightly, as if it was something she knew and felt. He realized that her silence was not only a manifestation of wisdom for him, but also an understanding that some feelings cannot be expressed in words. Her acceptance of his words was for him the confirmation he had been waiting for, the sign that his love for her was not just a figment of his imagination. When the silence between them became deep and complete, Lamar felt his heart filled with peace. Ida, who had remained a mystery and a source of inspiration for him, now revealed to him what he had always been looking for, but could not fully realize. He realized that her image was something more than he could have imagined. She became for him a symbol of the freedom he sought, and her presence, her acceptance of his feelings gave him strength. After this meeting, his soul found peace. He felt that now that there were no barriers between them, his feelings for her had become not just a passion, but something real, pure and deep. He knew that their bond would remain with him, no matter how their future lives turned out. Ida has become something for him that he will not be able to forget, and this memory will always accompany him. They didn't talk about the future, they didn't make plans. Their meeting was the end of the internal struggle that had lasted for so long. Lamar knew that their connection would exist beyond time and place, that she was a part of his soul that he could no longer neglect. Their silence was like a promise made by the heart itself, and that was enough. Now, returning to his grandmother, he felt strangely light. He realized that his conversation with Ida was not a farewell, but rather a finding of the truth that they had both been walking towards all this time. His grandmother greeted him at home with the same wise kindness as always, and Lamar realized that her silence was the blessing that allowed him to discover this love. Several days passed and Lamar was preparing to leave. His soul found peace, and now he knew that he could return to his life in the city, preserving the warmth of this love and the connection that would remain with him forever. Grandma, saying goodbye to him, looked at him with the expression that he will always remember. There was understanding and boundless kindness in her eyes. Lamar left the village, but his heart remained full. Now he knew that Ida would always be with him, a part of his soul, a part of the world he had found thanks to his grandmother. She became for him the shadow that guides him, reminding him of that freedom, of that love that remains even when all the words have already been said.